Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome to part 2 of this two-part piece on the 8 significant figures associated with Rochester Cathedral. In part 1, we came across St. Andrew, as well as the significant figures that founded Rochester Cathedral and whom introduced Christianity to the Kingdom of Kent and England as a whole, all the way back in the early 7th century. But in today's part 2 video, we're going to be moving off of early Christianity and moving towards the Norman conquest, through the medieval period and leading right up until the beginnings of the Reformation. So without further ado, let's continue looking at the significant characters associated with Rochester Cathedral, and arrive at our 5th character of significance, whose name sounds a lot like a wizard from a Tolkien novel. This man's name was Gundulf, with a U, who was the 30th Bishop of Rochester from the year 1075 until his death at the age of 84 in 1108. In terms of Gundulf's early life, Gundulf was born in the year 1024, and right up until his move to England in the year 1070, he served as a monk to the abbey at Bec, which is in the Normandy countryside, and as an abbot to the monastery at Saint Etienne, which is in Caen, along the coast of Normandy. When Gundulf did arrive in England in 1070, he was accompanied by his friend/mentor, Lanfranc, who was to become the first Norman Archbishop of Canterbury. And the job that these two men had was a tricky one. They were supposed to reorganise the English monastic system that had been in place since the early 7th century, when Christianity was founded. But not only was Gundulf a man of the cloth, a man of religion, he was also a great engineer and a great architect, building some of the earliest castles, cathedrals, churches, and the great structures that are from that early Norman period, some of which, of course, still exist today. The most important for this particular video is, of course, Rochester Cathedral. He had Rochester Cathedral built from the year 1080, and although he never lived to see its completion in 1130, it was still in that great design that Gundulf had put out all the way back in 1080. But not only that, Gundulf was also instrumental in building the castle in Rochester and giving provisions to the hospital that was being founded there as well. From 1078, he was sort of managing the construction of the White Tower, which is the central building to the Tower of London. It was also Gundulf who had the remains of St. Justus, the first Bishop of Rochester, and St. Paulinus, the 3rd Bishop of Rochester, moved into the new Rochester Cathedral, out of the old priory dedicated to St. Andrew. Now, over the course of Gundulf's life, he was well regarded by religious figures and successive kings alike. For example, when in 1089 the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc, sadly died, Gundulf was put in the position of running the English church and the monastic reorganisation that had been done since about 1070. Gundulf was never proclaimed as the next Archbishop of Canterbury, but was well regarded enough to lead the charge within the English church. He would lead this charge for roughly 4 years, when the vacancy was eventually filled in 1093. And also, Gundulf lived through the lives of 3 successive kings of England: William the Conqueror, of course, William Rufus, and Henry Beauclerc, each of whom well regarded Gundulf's abilities as an architect and an engineer. And it was a great loss when Gundulf died in 1108. Gundulf may have been responsible for constructing the earliest version of Rochester Cathedral from 1080, but it was a monk in the early 13th century by the name of William of Who that was to create this Gothic-style cathedral that we are used to seeing today. Our sixth character of significance has very little written about him and about his life, other than the fact that he came from the Who Peninsula, which is a portion of Kent which sits between the River Thames and the River Medway. He was alive during the early 13th century. He became a monk at the monastery attached to the cathedral between 1239 and 1241. And of course, the reason why he is the significant character within this lineup is because he oversaw the remodelling and in some cases reconstruction of portions of Rochester Cathedral itself, in that synonymous early medieval architectural style, Gothic. Moving swiftly to our seventh character of significance, we still find ourselves within the late 13th century, to a man called Walter de Merton, who was the 43rd Bishop of Rochester for the last 3 years of his life, between 1274 and 1277, dying at the age of 72. Walter de Merton is probably most recognised as being the founder of Merton College at the University of Oxford, which he founded in 1264, and spent the rest of his life building the logistics of this fledgling college. But de Merton is also recognised as a trusted advisor to Kings Henry III and his successor Edward I, serving as the Chancellor to these kings between 1261 and 1263, and then again just 2 days after King Henry's death in 1272, until exactly 2 years later in 1274. It was during this second tenure as Chancellor of England that Walter de Merton became pretty much the regnant of England, serving as the sort of de facto leader, whilst the successive king, Edward I, was over in the Middle East fighting in the Ninth Crusade. When Edward I returned from the Ninth Crusade in late 1274, Walter de Merton was dismissed as the Chancellor in favour of a more loyalist advisor to King Edward I. But as compensation, de Merton was given the title proclaimed as the new Bishop of Rochester. And although Walter de Merton did a very good job as the Bishop of Rochester, he did spend a lot of his time over in Oxford with this new Merton College that he was trying to build the legacy of. And it was on the 25th of October 1277 that, on his way back to Rochester, Walter de Merton fell off of his horse, quite badly in fact, because 2 days later Walter de Merton died of his injuries. Walter de Merton's legacy within Rochester Cathedral is in the fact that he is one of these 8 significant characters, known for founding Merton College and being a great advisor to Henry III, but also in the tomb that is situated within the cathedral walls, close to where the saintly figures of St. Justus, St. Paulinus and St. William of Perth also sit. And lastly, but by no means least, we have John Fisher, the 67th Bishop of Rochester, Bishop from 1504 until the 21st of May 1535, just 1 month before his execution by Henry VIII. Born in 1469, much of John Fisher's life past the age of about 13 was spent in the arms of education, through either theological studies or through becoming the Vice-Chancellor and then Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. And even after he became the Bishop of Rochester at the insistence of Henry VII, he still kept his connections to his old university. But it is in the last 10 years of John Fisher's life that is the most contentious and the most interesting for which to be discussed. Now, John Fisher had always been an ardent critic of the new Protestant faith of Christianity, and more specifically in the 1510s and 1520s, the ideas brought forward by Martin Luther over in the German states. So when in 1526 Henry VIII was in the throes of his great matter, whereby he pushed forward for a divorce with the former Queen Catherine of Aragon, the wooing and loving relationship that he had with Anne Boleyn, which culminated in a breakaway from the Roman Catholic Church under the Pope and the instigation of the new Church of England, a Protestant version of the Christian faith, John Fisher was very much a critic against that as well. In fact, he was such an ardent critic of these series of events leading from 1526 that assassination attempts were made on John Fisher's life in the early 1530s, presumably by supporters of the Boleyn family. This all came to a head in the year 1534, when the Act of Succession and the Oath of Succession came into effect. Signatories were basically asked to acknowledge Henry VIII as the head of the English Church, something which John Fisher refused to do. And much like his good friend, Sir Thomas More, he believed that the state should remain separate from that of the Church, not all one singular body. As a result of his refusal, John Fisher was arrested on treason charges and placed within the Tower of London. On the 21st of May 1535, having spent about a year within the Tower of London, John Fisher was made a cardinal to that of the new Pope Paul III, in the hopes that this would ease the tensions between Fisher and King Henry VIII. But in fact, this had the opposite effect. Henry VIII decided to try John Fisher under the Supremacy Act and the Treasons Act, removing the title of Bishop of Rochester from John Fisher. And on the 22nd of June 1535, just 1 month later, John Fisher was executed on the scaffold just outside of the Tower of London. In 1935, John Fisher was made one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales, proclaimed a saint alongside his good friend St. Thomas More, for which they share a saintly feast day, the 22nd of June, the day, of course, in which John Fisher was executed. Now, in terms of Rochester Cathedral during this Tudor period, it may have been the second founded priory and monastery all the way back in 604, but it was the second to last monastery to be dissolved under Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in 1542. Rochester Cathedral was then turned into a Protestant Church of England cathedral space. Now, of course, the cathedral's history spans well past the dissolution of the monasteries and the turning into a Church of England space. But these 8 figures that were sculpted in the 19th century chronicle the earliest, most significant characters within Rochester Cathedral's history. And with that said, I think I shall end my video here. Thank you for watching, thank you for getting to the end of this part 2 video, and I hope that you've enjoyed not only this, but also the part 1 as well. It's been different, it's been varied, it's chronicled about 1,000 or 2,000 years worth of history. So thank you again for watching, and I shall see you in the next video. Maybe something again to do with Rochester as well. Ciao!